So there's a lot of design inspired by evolution, which is used in many, many different contexts. So examples of this is genetic algorithms to solve optimization problems. There's a big field of evolutionary robotics, which is partly to solve robotic questions, but I think it's more inspired to understand some of the principles of how you, some of the principles underlying evolution, I guess. So the whole field called genetic programming, which is basically using genetic algorithms to learn rules in machine learning. And that's a big field. I would have said it's somewhere behind traditional machine learning, but it has some very strong advocates. There's obviously evolvable hardware, so that's where you take some field programmable gate arrays and you try to evolve some structure within those hardware to solve a problem. And then there's this huge field of artificial life, which I finished on, and there's people like Tom Ray, who produced Tierra, which is basically a program that evolves a slice of memory that contains programs, and those programs basically reproduce themselves. So it's much closer to how real evolution is, and it's a very fascinating piece of work. You get things like parasites occurring that throw away most of their genome, which is to do with reproducing, and just uses their neighbours to do that, and then you get a balance between these parasites and the main hosts. So there's quite a lot of sort of artificial life work, some of which is very good, and others of which perhaps isn't so good. So some of the applications are clearly used in engineering. So engineers really do use genetic algorithms. They come to me and say, how do you use a genetic algorithm? And I say, are you crazy? No, I say, do you really mean to do this? But it's there are real reasons why you should use genetic algorithms, but most of the reasons is that people consider them to be sexy. So genetic programming is a field where people really want to solve problems, and to some extent evolvable hardware is also something where they want to solve real problems. And then there's things that are really to do with trying to understand life, and some of those life issues are things like artificial life, and to some extent evolutionary robotics. I think there was an argument that maybe you could do real robotics using these evolutionary principles, but I think that's a program that sort of has had 20 years of development, and I don't think there's very many strong advocates for that. But there's a few still believing that evolution is the way to do mainstream robotics. Okay, I'm going to talk about genetic algorithms. But probably the best understood application of evolution. They are probably the simplest things that we can look at. They're very widely used, and they're what I know best. So that's perhaps, and that's a good reason for me telling you about them, because you don't want to hear things I don't know about. So, okay, genetic algorithms are a method to evolve a population of potential candidates to find a good solution to an optimization problem. Okay, so I'm going to actually give you another lecture at the end of today. I'm afraid I give you lots of lectures today on optimization, and seeing the optimization in a sort of slightly broader context, but today this lecture I'm just going to talk about genetic algorithms. So it can be seen as an engineering approach to solving hard problems, and that's what I'm going to talk about. So I'm not going to talk about some of the issues about biology. I'm going to talk to you about the issues of using these as just an engineer. They can be seen as a sort of mathematical formalization of very simple evolving systems, and we'll talk a little bit more about that tomorrow. And what I'm going to present is a very highly prejudiced view of what's important to make GAs work. Okay, so this is what I believe are important to making GAs work. Other people would tell you very different things. But it's my lecture, so I can tell you what I want. Okay, so here is a canonical GA. You initialize a population, and then for some period of time you evaluate the fitness. You select a new population based on the fitness. You mutate members of the population. You do crossover, and you return the best member of the population after some time. There's lots of variants on this, which I'll talk about some of those variants later. So let me give you a very quick example of this. So this is the graph coloring problem. So you're given a graph with some vertices and some edges, and what you want to do is you want to color the graph. You want to assign a color to each of the vertices to minimize the number of edges with the same colored vertices. So these are called color conflicts. So this is a perfectly colored graph because there are no colored conflicts. And how did I produce this? I produced this by firstly coloring the vertices and then putting in the edges so that I didn't get any color conflicts. So I cheated, but we'll see algorithms to do this, but don't cheat. Okay, so let's take the GA in slow motion. So you just generate a big population, and often people use random colorings. You could think of a more intelligent way of forming a new population. There's some advantages with just using a random population, is that it gives you a very diverse population to start off with. So these are just randomly colored populations, and then you have to evaluate the fitness. So you take a graph and you count the number of edges where you have vertices that are the same color. In this case, the cost is 8. And you select a new population by choosing preferentially fitter members. And one way of doing that is you assign some kind of weight that measures the fitness. So fitness is actually to do, technically in biological speak, fitness is a measure of the number of offspring you can potentially produce. Fitness is kind of used slightly ambiguously in evolution, in GAs, because people actually just talk about fitness as kind of any measure of how fit you are, rather than to be strictly proportional to the number of children you produce. So then you have some probability to do with your fitness, and then you select from this probability distribution. So there's many ways of doing the selection. There's many ways of going from your belief in how good your members of a population are to producing this fitness measure. And some of these are better than others, and we'll talk very briefly about how they differ and what they are. Mutation, you basically change the color of one or more of the vertices. So if we have a problem like this, we choose vertices at random, and so we choose this one, and we just change its color. Okay, and that may or may not increase the cost. In this case, it increased the cost rather than decrease the cost. We're trying to reduce the cost. I could do mutations that involve more than one more than one vertex. So I change those colors, and one of those. What happens? Well, yeah, it increases a. Sorry about that. I keep pressing the wrong button. So in that case, I just actually end up swapping where my color conflicts is. So that's a sort of blind mutation. Then in crossover, what I do is I take two members of my population. I usually select those at random, or I pair up members of the population at random, and then I take one half of one and the other half of the other. So in this case, I've taken this half of this one and this half of that one, and I've paired it up like that. I can also produce the complement of that, where I take this half of this one and this half of the other one. So often you can do the complement, and there's some advantages with doing both at the same time, is that you don't lose any genetic material. So there's usually a cost associated with crossover. So here are two graphs that are quite low-cost graphs. This one I actually evolved to find these, so these are quite low-cost graphs. If I then cross them over, so before I was crossing, I was sort of dividing them into half, but there's not really any particular structure here. So one way of doing crossover, called uniform crossover, is you just randomly take some of the nodes from one of the child, and you put, so I've randomly just chosen some of those vertices, and I've put the same colors here, and the rest of them I put into the other child, and then I fill in the rest from this child. Okay, and in this case I get a very large increase in cost, and so this is a cost of crossover. It can be a very, very disruptive operation, and that's something we're going to talk about at some length, is when is crossover a good thing to do and when isn't it. Okay, so this is a GA run, so I start off with a random population, I evaluate the fitness, I then do selection, so I have some way of turning, so that's not really evaluating fitness, it's evaluating some cost function, and I want to turn that cost function into fitness, and so what I end up doing is I decide to choose 4 of these, one of those, one each of these, and I'm going to replace these. So these are going to get replaced by this. And then I do mutations. In this case, I've decided just to mutate one node in each of these. When I do crossover, I don't have to do crossover on the whole population. So in this case, I cross this and this and this and this. And you get things crossed over, and then you get to the next generation. Right? And then you have to evaluate their fitnesses, you do selection, you then do mutation, you then cross over some members of your population, you carry on doing this. So evaluating fitness, okay, and I did far too many of these, but there's one more generation, I think, that I decided to show you. So just to show you, there's a long, boring process. And actually, because I'm doing crossover, I don't get much improvement in cost because crossover is pretty disruptive. Actually, one of the things you do notice, though, which is a point of showing you quite a few of these, is that the population is correlating. So for instance, all members of this population now has 2 greens in here, has a yellow here. They all have yellow hair. So even though they have rather different costs, they have quite a lot of similarity. And that similarity actually reduces the cost of crossover, because if you're crossing over things that are very, very similar, there's not such a big cost of crossover. Okay, so that's something, that correlation effect is an important effect to understand. Okay, so I'm going to finish by taking you through those sorts of operations a little bit more slowly and discussing ways of thinking about those operations. So one of the questions you ask is, well, how big should a population be? Okay, so this is an engineering question, this isn't the biological questions. And one of the problems with using small populations is they correlate very quickly. Okay, so usually a sort of typical correlation time for a population is its size. So if you increase the size of a population, if you double the size of the population, it takes twice as long for that population to correlate as a sort of a reasonably good estimate. Mutation uncorrelates populations, and that's one of the reasons, one of the good things that mutation is doing for you. So crossover becomes, in some ways, it becomes less effective. So there's 2 things: is that crossover can be very disruptive if you have very uncorrelated members of your population, and so you might want your population to correlate because it reduces the cost of crossover. But if all your individuals are identical, then crossover is doing nothing for you. Okay, so you want some diversity. So diversity is a good thing. So small populations, they tend to lose this diversity. There's something that happens in biological populations, which I said I wasn't going to talk about, but I obviously am, which isn't true necessarily in a GA, which is that correlated populations, they tend to have the same fitness. So selection correlates your population. Why populations correlate is because if you do selection and you get 2 members of a, you decide to select this twice, so you have 2 copies of this individual in the population, and that immediately means your population is much more correlated. And even though you do some mixing around, you're not losing that correlation. But if you have a correlated population, then they have very similar fitnesses, and the consequence of that is that there's not much selection pressure. There's not much difference in the population, and so there's not much to select for. Okay, and that means that small populations tend to do random drift in biological populations, and that was Sewell Wright's argument that small populations are actually good because you want to do random drift. And so there's a sort of approach that comes from this, what's called the shifting balance theory of Sewell Wright, which is a theory which says small populations are very good because you want to do this drift. And so what they do is they break down genetic algorithms into small populations called demes. So demes is a sort of biological term for small populations, and they kind of evolve these independently, and then every so often they have migration between these demes. Okay, I'm not going to talk about that because I believe, so in most GAs you're in charge of the selection pressure. And so you can increase the selection pressure if there's not a big difference. And you find if you actually increase the selection pressure, there's very, very little advantage of having demes. Almost always it's worse for you if you control the selection pressure. That's a controversial statement, but I've had a student who went out to try and find where demes were good, and he couldn't. right? Because it controlled for the selection pressure. If you look at papers, there's lots of examples where people say Dean's GAs are better, and that's because they don't control the selection pressure properly. Okay, so how big should a population be? I think, a population is very difficult to say. If you want an engineering solution, I can give you an engineering answer. It should be greater than 20, right? That's from some intuition. If you have it less than 20, well, it's okay. But there is actually some arguments saying you should actually have very small populations. But then you have to really control the diversity yourself. You have to make sure if you have very small populations that you're doing something to control that diversity. There's an argument which I think, is a first approximation which says population size doesn't matter. You're doing the same amount of search if you have a population of 1,000 and you go for some numbers of generations, or if you have a population of 10 and you go for 100 times more, or a population of 100 and you go for 10 times more generations. So you're sort of playing off the size of your population with the number of generations you can look at, but you're doing the same amount of search. And so actually one of the things that is true of a lot of GAs is that they tend to be relatively benign as how you control the parameters. There are occasions where controlling parameters is very important, but mainly you can choose whatever population size you want, and it's okay. So what's an optimal population size? It's a very big issue. I will actually address this once more where there's problems where I can tell you what the optimal population size is, but I use a population size of 100 and I've never found that to be too small or too big. People who do genetic programming will go around and say, I use population sizes of 500,000, because it's something to do with their personality. They like to have big computers and have big population sizes. I have to be careful because there's probably people doing GP in the audience, but I mean your supervisors, I don't mean you personally. Okay, there's another way of doing GAs, which is called steady state GAs. So it's pretty much the same, except every generation you only change one member of the population. So what you do is you initialize the population, you evaluate the fitnesses, and then for some numbers of times you select a single member of the population and then you mutate a copy of that member to create a new string, or you select two members and you cross them over to create a new string, but you leave the members you've selected in the population. You measure the fitness of that new string, so you only do that once, and then you select in some way as an unfit member of the population. You might just remove a random member of that population, and you replace it with your new string. So you're only changing one thing at a time, and then you continue doing that many times, and then eventually you return the best member of the population. There are strategies like always keeping the best member of your population. This is called elitism, which probably gives you some benefit, but it's not, I think, a major doesn't give you radically better solutions. So both generational GAs and steady state GAs are widely used. One of the things about steady state, so steady state GAs in a way sounds like a better solution, because it just seems more of an engineering solution. You're just having to do less evaluations of fitnesses, it seems like. Obviously you run them for much longer because the cost of just changing one individual is much better. But actually steady state GAs has twice the selection pressure of a generational GA, because you tend to select the member you select the members you're going to mutate and reproduce and duplicate, but you also select the member that you remove. It also has twice the genetic drift, because again you're doing two kinds of selection. You're selecting the fittest member, and then you're selecting another member, and so there's this sort of random genetic drifts. And one of the things is that steady state GAs correlate very, very fast. And so actually, in my experience, steady states are probably not advantageous over normal generational GAs. However, there's not very much in it, so using either doesn't really matter. Okay, so what about selection? So one of the things about selection is that populations typically become fitter, where you want them to become fitter, but they also become narrower. And that's produced by selection, because if you're selecting from a population, you basically increasing the numbers of these particular members of a population, so you're going to get this increase in the average fitness and a narrowing of the population. And then over time, your populations are going to get shifted to fitter, having fitter members, which you obviously want, and they're going to get narrower, so they tend to be narrow. And one of the things is what you want is you want your selection, you would want the mechanisms to make sure that your selection strength, or the amount that things are selected, is more or less the same in this and this. So you kind of want selection mechanisms that are in some ways invariant under what's called affine rescaling. So you can rescale your costs by in some linear way, and you want your selection mechanism to be the same, irrespective of that. Otherwise, so if you don't do that and you use sort of simple proportional selection, what tends to happen is that over time, when your populations get much, much narrower, you're not actually doing very strong selection, and then you're really just going into random drift. Okay, so selection mechanisms, there's one called ranking selection, so which has this property. So you rank, for instance, you say the least fit member of the population has rank 0, the fittest member of the population then would have rank p-1, and then you select with a probability proportional to its rank plus some parameter that controls the selection strength. Okay, so that goes from 0 to infinity. It doesn't actually allow you to have very, very strong selection, but it allows you to have a weak selection. So this is invariant to this, to actually any monotonic transformation of a fitness function. So it's even stronger than this affine invariance. And it can be used in combination with what's called stochastic universal sampling, which I'll talk about later. Tournament selection is probably the most popular selection. You choose two members of the population and you select the fitter. So it's very similar to ranking selection with roulette wheel sampling. So if you use roulette wheel sampling with ranking selection, it's actually mathematically it gives you exactly the same outcomes as tournament selection. And it's quite a useful way of doing steady state. In steady state GAs, it's a very simple thing to do. And you can control the selection strength either by choosing the least fit member of your pair, of your tournament, with some probability, and that weakens the effect of selection, or you can increase the strength of selection by increasing the tournament size. Although this is by far the most popular selection. It certainly isn't my favourite, partly because it's quite fiddly to control the control parameters, partly because it doesn't do anything about it samples very poorly. And people just believe that, well, there's some theoretical reasons why it's not my favourite one, but people also sort of just trust that they just use normal tournament selection without controlling the controls, without controlling the selection strength, and then they publish papers saying deems are better than non-deems, and in fact if you control for selection strength, that's completely untrue. So it sort of seems like a God-given selection mechanism because it's really nice and clean, but doesn't naturally control for selection strength, and you really want to do that. My favourite, which I'm biased, is something called Boltzmann selection, where you weight your members of the population according to your cost function, you multiply by some control parameter, and then you divide by the standard deviation of the distribution. So the point of doing that is that you get this affine invariance. If you do that, so theta, you have to calculate your standard deviation of the fitnesses in your population, but that really doesn't cost you any computational time. Now S controls selection strength, and so if you have S equals 0, you have completely neutral selection, and S equals infinity is you always choose the fittest member of the population. So it has a nice parameter that completely controls selection strength, and it has some nice properties, which I'm not going to go into, but theoretically you actually lose less genetic diversity doing this than you do using tournament selection. Well, you lose less diversity in the fitnesses for the same increase in the fitness. So I like this selection, but this is not a very well used selection. So once you've done selection, if you're doing a generational GA, you actually have an issue, is that you've decided the probabilities of choosing things, and then you've got you've then got to actually turn that into an algorithm to how to choose things with that probability, because you want to choose a finite population. So the standard way is roulette wheel sampling, where you make the pockets of your roulette equal to their fitness, and then you just play roulette p times to get new members of the population. Okay. And the problem with that is you get fluctuations. Is that you could get all members of your population ending up with the least fit members of your new population. You could be very unlucky and always lose at roulette and get the least fit member of your population, or you could get always the fittest member of the population. But neither of those are what you want. You want to have some. You want to maintain diversity. And so there's another way of doing this called stochastic universal sampling, which was proposed by Baker, where you basically you choose one random number, and then at equal intervals around the wheel you place balls, and so you place p balls around at equal intervals around here. Okay. So this again ensures that you select all members with the correct probabilities, but it gives you many less fluctuations. So there's many less ways of getting the right of sampling happening, and the proportions of times that a member is selected is very close to the probability. So this is a better way of doing sampling. There's just no way about it. This is a better thing to do. It's actually faster to implement than normal roulette wheel sampling. The only thing is, personally, I prefer roulette wheel sampling because it's much easier to do the mathematics and roulette wheel sampling than on this. I have done mathematics on this, but it turns out to be a nasty thing to actually exactly compute how to do that. But that's a silly point. The point is, if you're really using a GA, use stochastic universal sampling. There's no reason not to do that. It's not going to make a huge difference, but it usually gives you improved performance. So configuration, so genetic operation. So configuration is usually represented as a string. It doesn't have to be represented as a string, and certainly in genetic programming you usually don't use strings. You use much more complicated trees and things like that. And you can think of the operators as working at two levels, either genetic levels that we modify the string irrespective of the problem, or at the phenotypic level that the operators are actually, you think of how they work on the problem irrespective of the representation. So you can sort of think of two kinds of operations, the sort of genotypic operations, which is what I've more or less been talking about, so genotypic mutations or crossover, and these are sort of general purpose operations. You can work on all strings, but they tend to be dumb, right? So mutations, you just mutate things dumbly. And so they put the emphasis on representation. In order to get these GAs to work well, you have to have good representations. The other thing you can do is phenotypic operators. You can think of what they're doing on the phenotype, on the problem, but these have to be special purpose because they depend on the problem. So there's these two ways of thinking about how to do a GA. You can think about your problem and think about what operators you want to do good moves on that problem, or you can just think dumbly about, you've got a string, you're doing dumb things on the string, and then what you have to do is think, how do I represent my problem well on that string, to make that string, to make these dumb operations good.
Yep. If you're operating on the phenotype, aren't you always selecting on the basis of the phenotype? So evolution can't have a neutral variation.
Yeah, so you're certainly not doing it on. So this is certainly non-Darwinian. But so I'm kind of. So for instance, okay. So one of the things we'll see later is there's good ways of doing crossover for the graph coloring problem, but it really means you know what the graph coloring problem is doing. Right, so the genotypic, I mean, this is a sort of broad brush description. So the genotypic operations just say, well, I'm representing my colors by a string, and then I'm just doing these silly operations in the string. And my sort of phenotypic view is saying, well, I know what this string does. So actually forget the string. Let me look at my graphs and let me think of what I really want to do in terms of graph coloring. But it's not natural selection. Is that a...
I should say, if you want to have any sort of neutral variation, you need to allow evolution to act on genotype representation, so that selection can be applied to.
Yeah. So sorry for to do.
Neutral classical selective.
Yeah. So there's a huge. Literature. Well, not huge. There's a significant literature talking about. Are having neutral nets worthwhile? So do you want to represent your problems so that they do have these big neutral networks? I actually think the jury's out on whether that's advantageous or not. I mean, there's a lot of people who will claim it's advantageous, but I'm not sure The GAs that work better than any other things that I know tend to really concentrate on the problem rather than saying there's neutral networks. But that maybe because we don't understand neutral networks sufficiently well to understand how to explore those. But it's true. If you want to, so there's this question of how redundant do you want to make your representation, because redundant representations might allow you to explore the space in a neutral way and then find good places to do that, and that may be advantageous. So I wouldn't argue with that. Okay, so you can think of doing crossover, for instance. You could think of doing a crossover in an intelligent way that depended on in a sort of phenotypic way. So you actually know about your problem, and so you choose the breaking points to minimize the number of edges that you're going to you're going to break. So that would be a sort of phenotypic view. It's not a genotypic view because it means that you know about the problem. You actually know that these edges exist. We'll see later that there's actually much better ways of doing crossover for graph coloring, but that's tomorrow. So in biology, mutations are random changes in the genome. And so random mutations are doing two things for us. They're performing some kind of local search move, but they're also maintaining diversity. And so maintaining diversity can be good. What should be the optimal mutation rate? There's lots of arguments that actually go back, I think, to Fisher, although people like Mullenbein would claim that people often cite Mullenbein's paper if they're in the GA community on this, but I think you could certainly cite Fisher saying, well, there should be about 1 over L. I'll show you an example tomorrow very quickly where actually...
What's
L? Sorry, just length of your string. I should have said that. Thank you for that. So basically you do one mutation on the string. You might do two, but you don't do a fraction of that string. So if you read Goldberg, it tells you you do 0.01%, you do 1% or something. I don't know what it tells you. That's clearly crazy. I mean, clearly it depends on your string size, and you probably should be doing ones that change a small number of things in your string. So there's some sort of theoretical arguments, so I'll show you a model where actually the mutation rate has nothing to do with 1 over L, but by coincidence 1 over L seems to be quite good for most of the parameter ranges that you're interested in. There's no need to make the changes random. If you're an engineer and not a biologist, you can think of doing cleverer things, and many of the most effective GAs incorporate a natural search operator which is actually doing something, it's doing a series of good moves for you. So it's doing some neighborhood search, and these are often called hybrid algorithms. People call them mimetic algorithms, which I think is a crazy name. I think I also know the guy who called them that first, who's a friend of mine, but they're hybrid operators. Mimetic is very difficult now because it also means different things. It means something completely different. I mean, it means doing things, let's not go there. Because it's getting... I'm passing coffee time, so we should go very quickly. After function the reason why neighborhood search is often very good is that you can often do function evaluation very, very cheaply if you're doing lots of local search. And that's something which GAs don't naturally do. So if you do one mutation, you can often calculate very efficiently what the fitness is, but if you do crossover, you completely have to recompute the fitness usually. Okay, so recombination and crossover I'm going to be very quick on because we're going to talk about that at some stage, actually Tuesday. Population-based techniques, so one of the key things about population-based techniques is they do actually allow you to combine populations. So crossover can be useful, so they can, but in order to be useful, they need some diversity. If you have no diversity, you obviously, crossover is not really doing anything for you, and that diversity depends on your mutation rate and your selection strength. You require that your children have similar fitnesses to your parents, to some sort of first order approximation, and in some way of thinking about it, that may mean that they kind of contain the parents contain building blocks which the children can inherit. But I don't really want to go into this because there's a whole day which we're going to focus on that. I should say there's different ways of doing crossover. So there's, if you have string representation, you can think of just cutting these strings at a particular place and then swapping either half. You can do what's called multi-point crossover, which is you split the strings into various places, and then you take some from one child and others from the other child, and then you can take this to the extreme limit, which gives you what's often called uniform crossover. So you could create two strings, and then you basically randomly shuffle between those strings. So you can either take one of these children, or you can take both of those children. So you can, if you want to, bias the crossover towards one of the parents, and so that would make it would reduce the cost of crossover, but it would reduce the mixing effect of crossover at the same time. There's an extreme form of crossover, which is where you take your whole population and you just treat each site independently from each other, and just do crossover at that site. And this is an idea, so you find out the probabilities of your blues, your greens, your reds, and then in choosing at this particular site, and in choosing your new population, you choose each member at that site with this particular probability. And this is an idea that's used, for instance, in a large class of newer algorithms such as PBIL, which are trying to estimate, so the estimation of distribution algorithms, they try to estimate the distribution of what a good population should be like, and then they sample from that distribution, so that they don't have a sort of fixed probability, they have a model for the distribution of what a good population should be like. Okay, so let me finish here. If you're an engineer, you want to treat optimization as an engineering problem. If you're a biologist, you're interested in other issues. I think you have to choose a sensible selection procedure, and that means controlling for selection pressure, because I think that is an important thing. If you really want your things to work, then you should think of building in a neighborhood search rather than blind mutation, because blind mutation is quite an expensive operation in a way. If you use crossover, make sure it preserves sort of relevant building blocks, whatever that means. And the results are going to depend on your good representation of the problem, if you're going to do something at the genotypic levels, and good choices of your operators. So you need to choose the best population size. So there's lots of parameters that you have to control for. Population size, as I say, I find it not too critical. Selection strength, I think, is quite critical. It's not that... So quite often selection, tournament selection gives you a reasonable selection strength, but it doesn't always give you the best. You have to control things like the mutation rate, the frequency with which you do crossover. And you have to, so, you know, there is no science to this, it's a question of trial and errors. And if you do trial and error, you have to be aware that there's a lot of fluctuations, so you shouldn't be over-controlling your parameters, because a lot of the time you're just playing with noise. Okay, so coffee, and we should come back 20 past, so I'm sorry for overrunning 5 minutes.
Sorry for running in at the beginning there.
That's okay.
I came down from London today. I thought we were starting at 10 like we did last week.
Okay, no problem.
Yeah, it's a bit off-putting.
Not at all. I forgot about it immediately, so it was not at all off-putting, but that's fine.
I wanted to ask about this Deems thing.
Yeah.
Is there circumstances where it could be arguably beneficial in preserving?
Yeah, it looks okay.
Diversity in some